Welcome to the Fergus Falls Business Spotlight Podcast, the show that takes a deep dive into local businesses and the individuals that run our community. To guide you along the way, here's your host, Jacob Bittner.
Ooh, we got history. We're getting history today. Ben Underwood, welcome to the show. How are you doing this afternoon?
Excellent.
Excellent.
Thanks for having me, Jake.
Yeah,
or is it Jacob?
Jacob, whatever strikes your palate,
Okay.
or your voice boxes. I am really excited for this interview. I always just love authors first and foremost, because authors they just have so much information because they wrote books. So they typically have done hours and hours and hours and hours of research that people don't see inside. I mean, the books take a lot to write, but then all the information you get that doesn't make it into a book is fun to uncover, and just the process of how people uncover that. So, anyways, we're going to talk about, it's AJ. The name of the book is AJ Underwood, the Pioneer of Press. Is that correct?
AJ Underwood, Pioneer of Print.
Pioneer of Print.
And then
Yep.
the tagline, the story of a Minnesota newspaper man.
And that Minnesota newspaper is the Fergus Falls Daily Journal.
Yes, he founded that as, first of all, just the weekly journal back in 1873. And it went through, several kind of frequency changes, going to a bi-weekly, a tri-weekly, and then I believe in 1883, although I can't exactly remember that date, but then they went to a daily journal format, so Monday through Saturday. Yeah.
Interesting. Well, we're going to uncover it all. We're going to get into however deep the history goes with the Underwood name. The town of Underwood was named after you guys, so that must obviously... AJ Underwood had a huge impact. I mean, he is a huge, significant historical figure in Otter Tail County and just regionally here. I know, I'm just really excited for it. So you're not a beer drinker.
No,
I get a lot of guests who aren't, and that's okay. Today in particular, I ended up with like a whole little mini growler of beer to drink, but
you're going to have to down it all.
I'm just going to have to do my part. There's some coworkers here that might want some as well, but this is the Tangerine Dream from Outstate. So this is it's described here as a tangerine puree and orange cream flavor added to a lactose sour recipe create this deliciously fruited sour ale. It tastes like a dreamsicle, Ben.
Ah, nice.
So
brings me back to childhood memories of dreamsicles, which sometimes landed more in my clothes than in my mouth.
But I am excited for this. If you do change your mind and you wanna sample a little bit, I've got a little sample glass for you.
All right.
Otherwise, to thank some other sponsors here: Atlas Outdoor Services, Stumbino's Coffee. You drink Stumbinos?
Yes.
Big fans of Stumbinos. Victor Lundeen's, Elks Point Bar and Grill, all just really greatly appreciated. No updates on the Smash Burger saga. If you're not a podcast listener, you won't be familiar with the Smash Burger saga, but I'm always looking for a date on Wednesday nights. Buy one, get one Smash Burgers at Elks Point. I'm always looking for dates.
Oh.
So
how's that going?
It's going. It's the offer's out there for anybody who wants to participate, whether it be a friend. I would just, Smash Burgers are out there for anyone.
Yeah.
They are not just me and my potential Smash Burger girl, but potentially listeners and their Smash Burger girls, So, but anyways, Ben, talk about your history a little bit before we go way back into your family history, just your life, where you grow up, and then we'll go back to the family history a little bit.
Well, I'm a native of Fergus and was born in 1954. my father was the fourth publisher of the journal, Charles, and he served in World War II, came back from World War II in the early or in the late 40s, and began work at the newspaper. And he actually married a high school sweetheart of his, Barbara Benson, who their family operated a mortuary and furniture making business in downtown Fergus Falls. And you can see the Benson building. It's on the corner of Court and Lincoln. So anyway, I came around 1954 and went through the various school systems in Fergus Falls. Went to the University of Minnesota, and then I came back and began work at the Daily Journal in late 1978, and worked there until
what year? Sorry, what year you say you graduated high school?
1973.
Okay.
So came back in late 78 and worked at the Journal in advertising, sales, and marketing, and kind of the business side of things. And then worked there until 1986, and then it was sold to Thompson Newspapers, a newspaper chain. The Journal was.
Okay.
Yeah.
Who owns the Journal now then?
Well, it's WIC Communications.
WIC Communications owns it now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that's a conglomerate as well, a larger corporation as well.
Yes, as far as I know, but I'm not totally.
Again, and this is not a interview that's affiliated or associated with the current operations of the Daily Journal.
Mm-hmm.
I want to make that very clear. Like, you're not a representative of the Daily Journal. I've reached out to them for interviews. I would love to have a representative from the Daily Journal come on and talk about their current operations and everything they have going on, but that's not what this interview is. This interview is about the history and the roots of the Daily Journal.
Mm-hmm.
So, so you worked for the Journal up until the time they were sold?
Yes.
And then you were done working for them at that point?
Well, excuse me. Yeah, I think it was sold in. It kind of was, I knew about the pending sale, but it took a while to kind of come to fruition. And then it was announced in, I think, September of 1985.
Okay.
And I worked maybe one more year and a half, and then, left. Then I was a financial advisor for 11 years, and then
did you go to college?
Yeah, I went to the University of Minnesota.
That's right. Okay.
University of Minnesota,
and your degree,
Twin Cities.
Your degree was in
journalism, advertising,
okay,
and speech communications. So,
okay.
Speech communications.
Speech communications.
Yeah, and I was a financial advisor for 11 years following my stint at the Journal. Then I founded Lake and Home magazine in...
you founded Lake and Home magazine?
Yeah. I founded Lake and Home magazine in 1999 and operated that for 15, 16 years.
Okay. So I'm going to come back to the career, but I don't want to skip too far ahead.
Okay.
Because we just jumped from the mid-'80s to 99 with Farm and Home magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that you don't have to share too many details about your family if you don't want to, but your kids, I graduated with Wade,
yes,
and I assume he came into the world in 1990.
Yes,
or
1989.
89, he's the same age as me.
Yes.
And then, oh my gosh, I just totally blanked.
And his sibling, he's the middle kid, and his siblings are Jack, the oldest,
and Liz.
Yep.
Jack I was blanking on Jack's name there. So
yep.
Jack is the oldest. So when did you and your wife get married then?
1982.
And are you guys high school sweethearts? Or how did you guys meet each
well,
other?
I knew her in high school, but she was in the class above me. So, in that case, a lot of times you're lower on the totem pole, when
We've had a few of those stories about like not quite high school sweethearts that ended up together after the fact, after you settle in as adults a little bit. Typically, it has to do with the male relentlessly pursuing, but that's usually how those love stories go.
Yeah.
Anyways, so your career then shifted obviously towards, by the mid to late 90s, it shifted, must have been towards this magazine then.
Yeah, you go through some research, some business planning, kind of some of my interests in architecture, and so anyway, founded the magazine, Lake and Home magazine.
And that magazine's still going today.
And that magazine is
Lake
still
and Home.
going today, operated by the gentleman that I sold it to, Kip Johnson.
Okay.
And so, I did it for about 15, 16 years, and like you just mentioned, it is still in existence.
Good. You probably had pretty good timing on the exit strategy of a magazine. That seems like pretty good, and maybe a little late on the exit of that.
Well,
maybe.
I think he's done well with it.
Still. Okay.
And he's got into some key lake markets that I didn't really do a very good job in penetrating. But if you look at Lake and Home magazine currently, they have quite a few advertisers from Alexandria and Brainerd. So the thing that was a tough go for Lake and Home magazine was the financial crisis in 2007, 8, 9, and kind of really hit hard on the building industry. A lot of contractors exited the business, and nobody was building, and so that made our advertising carry kind of slump.
Right.
And so that was a tough period of time. So, but we kind of made it through. But Kip has really done a nice job with it since 2016. And
so were you, when you were operating the magazine, was that a side gig, or that was a full time?
Full-time,
you were doing that full time, and so you weren't doing financial advising at the time.
No, I quit that, and and so it was full time.
And then sold the magazine, and what did you do after that?
I kind of began the research for this book, so I'd make periodic trips out to the Ottertail County Historical Society, which I give a lot of kudos to.
Gosh, that's
fantastic research facility.
Amazing resource.
And so they have the old journals there, both in hard copy and on microfiche. And
what's microfiche?
Well, is the microfiche? They take pictures of the newspapers, and you kind of put it in a machine and you go through. But I elected to go through the old hard copies. And
this was the original journal, late 1800s original journal.
Yep. And they have all the copies, and they also have other copies of early newspapers there. And so that's what I began to do. And, I kind of had this idea rattling around my head about A.J. Underwood. Had kind of a number of interesting chapters in his life, but how to put all this stuff together, and kind of scared me, to be honest with you. Where do you go with the project? And so when you're kind of scared of something, you kind of just put it off to the side, and that's what I did for a few years, kind of in that maybe 2017 to 1920 time period. And I was a part-time bus driver for the Outer Express.
Okay.
And so I learned a lot, and then COVID hit, and they furloughed a lot of the part-time people. The COVID kind of dampened, or the ridership was not at the level it normally was, and so anyway, then I kind of jumping here a little bit into 2021, although there's some backstory to what I'm going to tell you. I'm kind of guessing that in maybe the fall of 2017 or 18, Peggy said, hey, there's my wife Peggy said there's a Minnesota book tour coming through Fergus Falls, like on a Wednesday night out at the community college, and there were the Minnesota Book Award winners in all the various genres of books, and they gave a little spiel. They read a little bit from their passage, or from their book, a little brief passage, and then gave a little background on themselves, and it was kind of an interesting session, maybe about 8 or 9 authors. And one guy said, well, I got a lot of help in kind of my writing and organization and conceptualization on his book from the Loft Literary Center. So I proceeded to go home and kind of look up on the website the Loft Literary Center, which is for lack of a better term, a writer's haven. They sponsor all kinds of writing courses, and they're physically located in Minneapolis, Minnesota. So I kind of kept my eye on a few. I actually took a few classes at the Loft, where you had to go to the Loft, and which is on Washington Avenue in Minneapolis. And then in late 2020, I noticed that going down on their website and looking at their tabs, they had a year-long writing project. And I read about it, and they had new for 2021, a new format where previously you would have to go every Tuesday night to the Loft and actually physically be there with a class and meet. Now they had a online session, a Zoom. And so, hey, I kind of thought this might be the gelling thing for me to get going on the book. So I enrolled. And so for beginning in January of 2021, on Thursday nights, I was online in this class from 6 to 9 p.m. every Thursday night, and then certain Saturdays. The thing, Jake, that it helped me, as I said, I was kind of dealing with procrastination or
writer's block,
or just didn't want to address the project. It forced me to begin to write and to shape the story. And I was in what was called the track, or the genre, creative nonfiction / memoir. And there were 12 other classmates and then an editor, instructor. And they were from across the nation. And I've got maybe some interesting anecdotes I could tell you about some of the class members. But what you would have to do is write, and then you would have to submit your chapter or your certain amount of writing to the other class members for workshopping and evaluation, as well as the editor. So slowly, I kind of began to build the book that way.
That's a really, so there's, it's safe to say that you wouldn't have done this without some guidance and help from some other people, or maybe eventually that like streamlined the process.
I hate to admit it, but you're right.
Yeah.
I wasn't totally self-motivated, somewhat self-motivated in the research, but getting going on the writing was tough.
So this book here, and let me see this real quick here. If I can grab it. This book, is it published through them then? Is that through the, let's set that up here for now, though, so people can see it. But
no.
So it's self-published. It's a self-published book still.
Well, I'll tell you a little bit. As part of the class, we did kind of dive into the book industry,
Right.
and even after the class, I took some more classes from some loft people about, okay, you got a manuscript now. Now what do you do with it? And
so that was a strictly like creative writing course.
Yes.
And then the continued education was publishing, final copy, all that business side of the industry.
And as part of the class, the instructor, editor, kind of gave you a quick edit, but it wasn't really a whole in-depth thing. But so I learned kind of through some classes. The book industry is dominated by the 5 major publishers in New York City, and in order to penetrate that market, you need a literary agent. So it's like an agent that goes to bat for you, and
a literary agent.
Yeah,
Interesting.
and pitches the book or pitches the manuscript for potential publication by one of the big publishers. Then a little bit down the continuum are the major university presses and kind of regional presses that are throughout the United States. Then right smack dab in the middle are the hybrid publishers, and the hybrid publishers take your manuscript and they find their creative people to improve it, meaning editors, graphic designers, proofreaders, historical fact checkers, but you as the editor or you as the author pay for those services. Then on the other far end of the continuum is self-publishing, where you can just strictly upload your files to Amazon or other self-publishing companies. So I did some research, and in the Twin Cities market, there are 2 hybrid publishers. I'm missing a key point too here, Jake. With the hybrid publishing model, you come out of that and you own the book. If you go to the 5 major publishers, they now own your book.
Right.
So anyway, there are 2 hybrid publishers in the Twin Cities market. I can't remember one of them. And the other pretty well-known one is called Beaver's Pond Press.
Beaver's Pond Press, and that's what's on the book here.
Yeah.
Okay.
They take maybe 25% of manuscripts submitted to them and accept them or want to work with you as an author. So I remember nervously submitting my files through their internet site, and I did it with the other hybrid publisher, and waited a week, and you kind of have that apprehension, but then I think in about 10 days I heard from Beaver's Pond Press, and they wanted to talk to me. So I went to St. Paul and we began a relationship. I kind of liked what they laid out and what their cost estimate and the timeline and all that. And so that began my relationship with Beaver Swan Press.
And obviously, like you're in bookstores, Barnes and Noble and stuff. Are you distributed in bookstores?
Yes, I am. Although when you are a product of a hybrid publisher, you're known as an indie book author, independent, and it's a little bit of a tougher sale to get into some of these major bookstores. But I am carried by a pretty reputable book distributor, Itasca Books, out of Minneapolis.
Okay.
And I'm in a few bookstores, but bookstores I found, and I've visited several in Minnesota, and bookstores kind of, they don't, you realize that book business is, the bookstore is in business for their own interests, and a lot of times they're not going to maybe take a chance on stocking your book.
Right.
And
they don't want to buy anything if it's not going to sell.
Yeah, and I understand that. And also, they kind of look at you a little, what's the word I'm looking for? If you have a presence with your own website, which I do have a pretty professionally designed website with 2 buttons to sell via Amazon and through Itasca Books. And they don't like to see that, bookstores, because Amazon is kind of a dirty word in their business. And so anyway, what I'm trying to describe is it's a challenge getting your book out and marketing it, and so I found that out now that's kind of after the publication, you're pretty happy about getting the book published, but it's a challenge to get it out, marketing it, getting it into bookstores, etc. So
we're almost a half hour into the interview here. What did I say? It was going to be maybe an hour. We're definitely probably going to have to go over an hour because we haven't even got into the content of AJ Underwood's life. Okay. And this is the whole point of the interview, but it was really cool to hear that setup. That's a good setup for the people to know the process of your life and what you went through to get to the point where you wanted to uncover this family history, which is really cool because not very many people have. Everybody has a family history, but not very many people have such a rich family history that involves starting a newspaper and getting a town named after you and all of that stuff. So AJ Underwood, let's talk about his life.
AJ, whose full name is Adoniram Judson Underwood, was born, I think, in 1832 in upstate New York, and his family moved when he was the last of 11 children, and they moved, I think, when he was in his early years. They moved to the Warren, Ohio area, which is Trumbull County, Ohio, and he worked as an apprentice printer when he was kind of in his teens for the Western Reserve Chronicle, which is, I think, still in existence and a fairly well-respected paper out in that area of Ohio. Then, kind of, there was the Go West ethic, and in this area of Trumbull County, there were a lot of neighbors that were moving to Minnesota. So he jumped on a steamboat in 1855 and made his way to St. Paul and took up work. And this is pre-Minnesota statehood. Minneapolis was known then as St. Anthony, and St. Paul was St. Paul. But he began work.
Do you know if that was before Southwick? Because that's what Underwood was used to be called, right? Southwick. We're gonna get that. We're gonna get to that, aren't we? Okay.
Yeah, we'll get to that.
Okay.
But,
So he was in Minneapolis area before Minnesota was formed.
Yep. And so he worked as a printer for the St. Anthony Express and the St. Paul Pioneer for a couple of years, and he lived in a boarding house in Minneapolis. But with all these, he knew about these fellow Ohioans that had come to Minnesota, and interestingly, kind of maybe like a lot of settlement happened, you kind of wanted to be by some people you knew.
Yeah.
And he purchased a land claim, or made a purchase of a piece of property out in the Medina Long Lake, and there's lots of long lakes, but this is the Medina Long Lake area, a little north of Lake Minnetonka.
Okay.
So it's kind of western metro now.
Okay.
And so he would go out there on weekends and kind of commiserate with his fellow Ohioans, and he began work putting a shanty together, a little house, and so he worked for a few years, and then in 1857 he decided to return to Ohio and marry his childhood sweetheart, and they kept correspondence, and then kind of just quickly moving through his life, where are we going to live? And they elected to move back to Minneapolis. So things are kind of going along, and all of a sudden they have 2 kids, and 1861 rolls along. He's 29 years old.
That's Civil War era, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
And he enlists in he enlists in this outfit called Company L, the Minnesota Sharpshooters. And they had the newest sharp 52 caliber rifles, and these were not muzzle loaders. These were breech loading, and
well before their time.
yeah. And what's amazing to me is, as far as I know, none of the Underwoods were great shots or hunters, but AJ, in order to qualify this, you had to put 10 rounds into this certain bullseye from 200 yards, and he qualified. But anyway, he's in the Civil War, and he's in the Maryland campaign area, where there were lots of battles in this time period of 1861 to 62. And so September 17th, I think, 1862, the Battle of Antietam occurs. And it's very fierce fighting, and he gets a musket ball through his right thigh in this battle, and has to retreat with kind of the whole 1st Minnesota Regiment. This sharpshooting outfit kind of got merged into the 1st Minnesota Regiment.
So, and honestly, I'll never be ashamed to admit something I don't know, but there were Civil War battles fought up here in Minnesota.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
Or was that what you were saying?
No, this was Maryland.
Maryland. I'm sorry. I was surprised by that. I was like, what? Okay. That's what surprised me. Maryland. Okay.
Yeah.
I was like, I didn't think anything happened up here during that time.
Yeah. Maryland. So,
okay.
Many, the Battle of Bull Run, there's kind of a lot of battles that happened over the summer of 1862 into the fall.
Okay.
And so he
got shot.
He got shot. got kind of evacuated, spent some time in a hospital in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. One of the nurses said she was a native of Minnesota, and so he asked, "What's your last name? What was your maiden name?" She said Ramsey, and he asked her, "Do you know the governor of Minnesota, Alexander Ramsey?" She said, "It's my brother." And he said, "Well, I know Alexander Ramsey from kind of being in the newspaper business, because politicians would come to these newspapers, and so he was the current governor." Long and short of it, he kind of went to bat on getting him a discharge, so to speak, and back to Minnesota.
The governor of Minnesota at the time.
Yeah. Kind of just an interesting tidbit there. But he gets back to Minnesota and kind of goes through some recuperation, elects not to go back into the printing business, but they move out to the shanty, or to the acres
By Lake Minnetonka.
Yeah, kind of north of Lake Minnetonka in Medina, and they begin farming. And so
Sounds like a happy life, just out there in a shanty farming,
and
before time was time.
Yeah. So he begins farming, and I got some research documents that show the amount of crops. He had wheat, corn, oats. It lists the number of livestock they had,
and you uncovered this through family history or the Historical Society? He kept those records?
A little of both.
Okay.
There's also a guy that had done quite a bit of history of all these Ohioans that had moved to Minnesota. And he had some connection from relatives. And so
prior to this book, there was plenty of information out there about A.J. Underwood.
Yeah.
I mean, this is probably the most completed version. It's like a culmination maybe of that research into one book about his life. But he has obviously, when you look at like the history of the town of Underwood, you're going to find a bunch of information about A.J. Underwood.
Yeah. So anyway,
So
he starts farming,
out farming north. Yep.
and so this is it from 1863 to the early 1870s. He a lot of these Ohioans were very civic minded, and the same with him, and he's urged to run for the Minnesota state legislature. So he runs for a spot in the Minnesota legislature and gets elected. And so he serves in 1870, which is, I think, the 13th Minnesota legislative session, and again in 1871, 72 in the 14th Minnesota legislature. The key point why I'm saying this is somewhere in the state capitol, he runs into George B. Wright.
Yep.
And the guy in the statue in Fergus Falls, who is a land developer and surveyor in greater Minnesota. And he has an office in downtown Minneapolis. And George B. knows a little bit about his background and knows he was a printer, and urges him to come up and look at his grand development, Fergus Falls. So George B. Wright
was the developer for James Fergus, right? Or was because
I'm not sure exactly what,
because I know I've uncovered this with Chris Schulke. I have so much time retaining all the information, but I know we've uncovered the history of George B. Wright with Chris Schulke before on the show, and how he incorporates in with James Fergus and naming of the town and all that stuff. So, but A.J. Underwood, I mean, Fergus was founded in 1870.
Yeah, you could say,
somewhere around there is kind of around this time. So he was in that group. He was in that group with George B. Wright and the early developers of Fergus. He was kind of in that early elitist era of Fergus Falls.
Yeah, and actually founding the Journal here in 1873, but there was already a newspaper here.
There was?
Yeah.
What was that?
It was the Advocate, operated by this guy with a great name, Orange King. And AJ actually knew Orange from crossing paths at Fort Snelling. They were in training together in the Minnesota Regiment of the Civil War. But anyway, Orange King was up here and founded the Advocate in 1871.
And that became the Journal, or it got squeezed out
Well,
by the
they
Journal?
competed. They competed for a number of years, and eventually it was kind of acquired by AJ. But they were fierce competitors, which is, when you think multiple newspapers in a small frontier town. But that's the way information was disseminated back in this time era, was largely through newspaper. So
yeah, I did. We're not going to get too deep into it, but I did a little bit of research on like the history of how news was distributed before the newspaper, and it's actually very fascinating. I think like my favorite part of history when looking into it was probably like the Middle Ages, when they would have like somebody standing in the town square ringing a bell and then making announcements, like reading announcements. I could just imagine someone at Speece Park go out there on a Saturday morning and they ring a bell and the town gathers around to hear this person read the news for the day. And that's how they got it. So it's very fascinating. So there was a newspaper so this other guy that started the newspaper, obviously he must have had a history with George B. Wright. Do you know much about the other paper?
Well, I think it was a pretty reputable, well-written newspaper, but he and George B. Wright did not see eye to eye. And George B. Wright really wanted to see Fergus grow and grow immediately. And I don't think that Orange King adopted that same philosophy or he wasn't cooperating. And that's kind of why the entry or the overture to AJ to come up. And
it's really interesting how you mentioned there was two newspapers. Obviously, a lot of that industry got shook out in the early years, and most of if it wasn't associated with some big city, you pretty much had a monopoly on the town you were in as a newspaper. I mean, there's very few once you get into further into time, wouldn't you say that was kind of a monopolized industry overall?
Yes.
Every town had its own little monopoly on the newspaper.
Yes. Well, as you went along in time, but in Fergus Falls, there were at times 3 or 4 newspapers competing.
Okay.
I mean, it took a while for it to consolidate into more of a just single newspaper, although in urban areas, a lot of times there were maybe 3 or 4 papers competing. But now, now it's kind of a whole different thing. But I'm going to say in the 50s, 60s, 70s, it was a single newspaper.
Kind of consolidated down. So or late 1800s then, the early years of this, after consolidating down to one paper in town, squeezing out the original competition, how did that continue to develop? And I'm curious because it looks like 1881, the town of Underwood was renamed. So he must have made some significant impact.
Yeah, the story I'm aware of, I think Underwood had a couple of names back then, Southwick and Turtle.
Yeah.
Turtle something.
Yeah. So what I have here is Southwick. It was originally known as Southwick, with the post office called Turtle Lake.
Yeah.
Turtle Lake Town,
Yeah.
Southwick.
Yeah. And AJ helped get a railroad line into Underwood, and the townspeople kind of recognized that in his efforts. And I think also they wanted to, you'd have to consult a real Underwood historian about this, but I think they kind of wanted to have just one name rather than all these names floating around. And so I think they made a petition through the Department of Interior, and eventually it got to be named Underwood. So,
That's cool.
Yeah.
That's a cool story. So he was involved with establishing railroads as well.
Well, he lobbied to get an extension through, but he had no ownership or anything. But just railroads were a major, development thing. So he and George B. Wright, in that early 1870s, there was no direct railroad line coming to Fergus Falls.
That's what built. I mean, we talked about that with Schulke too. That is really what established our community. Was the Northern Pacific, or I don't know if it was
the
Burling,
St. Paul,
what it was called at the time.
Yeah, the St. Paul, the St. Paul, Minnesota, Manitoba line coming from the Twin Cities through St. Cloud, and it had ended at Alexandria. And the thing that Chris is probably aware of, and maybe you are with the talks, is that railroads went through a lot of ownership changes, bankruptcies. It was kind of a tough industry in that 1870s time period. And then the empire builder, James J. Hill, who made a lot of money in St. Paul in shipping products, both on riverboats and through some rail lines, he put his money into the St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Manitoba, and they got it to come to Fergus Falls, the extension, and it got here in 1879. And, George B., along with A.J., recognized that they needed a railroad to be competitive to ship, agricultural products and to move people. And it was already happening in Perm, and there was a line west of Fergus Falls that went through Campbell and Breckenridge, and so it was really important, with a lot of hiccups, so to speak, back and forth, and there was a lot of lobbying in the legislature and stuff.
This is fascinating uncovering this, because politics was the spark. Obviously, when you're founding communities, it's going to be politicians and political people that have influence over what's being developed and what's happening. So he got into legislation, or got into, was it the Senate or representative at the time, or do you know what they were calling that branch at the time?
I don't, but there was an agreement that there was some lobbying, and I can't remember. I think it's part of the book that the legislature guaranteed, or not guaranteed, that's the wrong, but there was a date of completion set for 1879, and that it was completed
For the railroad?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So
interesting. Well, because I just look at it and it's like the opportunity is obviously there for those who are politically connected. And it's very fascinating to see how the history of our town is really founded in people that were politically connected in Minneapolis before the founding of Fergus Falls, and how that spread out to our region here. So how he lobbied then. Obviously, he started the newspaper, ran the newspaper for a while, I assume. Did he sell the newspaper? Was he a kind of in politics while he was running the newspaper in the early years of the town?
He resigned his position in the Minnesota legislature because he was leaving that Medina district. So, but he knew of other legislatures and had some connections. But so AJ lived for 12 years, or started the newspaper in 1873, and he died in 1885. So his stint as publisher was 12 years. But his oldest son had helped him as a typesetter, and as 14, 15, 16 years old, was involved in the newspaper. And so he took over in 1885, and he operated until the early 1900s, or kind of kind of another story here is that Benjamin Underwood lived on the west side of Lake Alice. And
this would be your great-grandpa.
This would be my great-grandpa. And his house blew into Lake Alice during the cyclone of 1919. And I don't know if that prompted him or what, but also I think he was kind of maybe losing some interest, or he was 60-some years old at that time, and he moved to L.A., which is kind of interesting. He and his wife moved to Los Angeles. So in the 1920s, early 1920s. So then it became his son's. Next was Robert, the publisher. So Robert operated it from the 1920s until the late 50s, when my father took over kind of in the early 60s as a publisher. So the whole legacy, the publishing, Underwood Publishing, ran from 1885 till 1985, so kind of 112 years.
Wow. That is crazy. And then what year did you say those other newspapers were popping up and trying to compete with the Daily Journal?
Well, mostly during the early stages.
The early to mid 1900s, probably.
Well, in the 1870s, in the 1880s, in the 1890s, and I don't want to give away some kind of great content in the book, but the chapters I think people will really like is about C.F. Kindred, who was a land salesman for the Northern Pacific, lived in Brainerd, and in 1880, the Minnesota legislature did some redistricting, and I think they only had like maybe 3 legislative districts, and they added a 4th and a 5th to or for people to be elected in 1882. And so C.F. Kindred, without a whole lot of political background, but with a lot of money and kind of a lot of panache and just wanting to kind of elevate himself into politics, put himself into contention for this new legislative position, and this was for like being the federal, legislative, and that district ran from Moorhead over to Duluth and the whole rest of the state north. So he went down to St. Paul and met with this guy, Mr. Hall, who operated a newspaper in St. Paul, and convinced him to start a competing paper in Fergus Falls, which would become the Daily Telegram, and the whole idea was to promote his candidacy, kind of for his position in the 5th district, and so another name you might just know from history when you go up and down I-94 and you're close to Alexandria is Knut Nelson.
Oh, yeah.
And he was his competitor in this new 5th district. So it was Charles F. Kindred versus Knut Nelson. And
Interesting.
And so
he started the newspaper,
so he started this Daily Telegram
basically as a campaign tool.
Yeah. And so he and AJ hated each other, and you could tell in the text of the newspapers during that time period how much vitriol there was, and stuff. And so that's a kind of a good chapter.
Yeah.
Some good stuff in the book.
So we kind of touch on the ownership of the journal after you guys were done as publishers, the Underwood family. Well, it really changed ownership before you guys left as publishers, right? Because when did you say that first ownership shift happened?
1985.
Okay, so it was up until that time that the journal was originally sold.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. So sold to Thompson Newspapers, and then there was a couple of other operators, chain newspapers. I can't exactly remember all their names, but now to Wick Communications. So,
Wow.
yeah.
So what else stands out in the book that we didn't touch on that was like, oh, that's kind of a cool thing? Or what else is in there for the people?
Well, the whole aura of frontier life. When you life was slower, and horses were this was kind of pre-electricity. Horses were the method you got around, and I try to show that lifestyle or that period of time, what it was like to live in a frontier town in the 1870s, 1880s. His wife was an entrepreneur, and she, Nancy, and they'd been here 1 year, and she founded a dress store, a dress and hat store, which I kind of find, interesting. So essentially, they had kind of two entrepreneurs in the family. So
was that anything?
And that's a chapter in the book.
Was that anything that would have stood out in history, or just a little department store that got fizzled out in history?
Yeah. I can't remember when it went out of business, but there was a need for women's clothing. The town was growing, and So
it's interesting to think about Fergus Falls and the fact that the population of our community really, really grew up until the 60s. We were just growing, arrows up until about the 60s. And then we just kind of flatlined. Something happened in our community politically, probably somewhere in the 60s, that stunted growth, or I don't know what. I really don't know what would have froze our growth at that point. But it's really fascinating to look at Fergus Falls population. And then you see in the 60s, that's when all the other surrounding areas really started picking up their population. So, well, I appreciated this. So the book starts with the family history. Where does the name Underwood come from? Like, do you know the roots of your family name?
It's Dutch English.
Dutch English. Okay.
Yeah. I think readers will kind of enjoy the there's some flashbacks about his time in the Civil War, and there's some, just when you say mention other stuff in the book, what was school like in Fergus Falls?
Yeah.
And I got a little chapter in there about school, and
that'd be a good episode
and
there, yeah.
also, if you're one of these people that really like early hand press printing technology, I tried to describe what it was like to produce a newspaper on one of these early Arho Washington hand presses.
Why don't you give me the 30-second version of what it was like to make a newspaper back in the day?
Well, when you had to set up type and grab them out of type cases with these little pieces of type, and then put them in backwards into a form, it was a laborious, long, tedious process. And actually, you might get a kick out of this, Jake. The people in the printing industry back, there were contests about how quickly you could set up like a newspaper or a, or a certain document or something like that. But it was just a lengthy, laborious process when you consider where communication is today with digital and what have you. This was a labor of love, so to speak. So, yeah.
Well, I didn't leave us too much time to get into like the future outlook, current operations of things. I mean, like I said, I hope to get the Daily Journal, somebody from the Daily Journal on to fill in that part of it. We don't have the time to speculate. It's pretty clear to see where the industry has gone with print. I had an interview with a guy, Liberty Business Systems. They do printers and setup and stuff, and just the world's going digital. And you saw a huge number of newspapers restructure, go under, go bankrupt, post 2008, into the 20 teens that just set the framework. And then COVID really even hammered that home a little bit more. You even see, like I said, I don't want to get into the Daily Journal's operations now too much. They have more of a digital model they're going after now. I don't know how many people get newspapers delivered to their house anymore. I think there's something probably still kind of cool and nostalgic about picking up a newspaper if you come from a different generation. My generation doesn't have that.
Yep,
We don't have that nostalgia association to picking up a newspaper, but I could see how my parents' generation your generation would. So I don't know. Lots to consider there.
Yeah. Just to follow up to your kind of a newspaper, a guy that I think he's written a couple of books about the decline in the newspaper industry, and one of the things that really impacted was Craigslist. They took over classifieds, which were kind of the bread and butter of newspapers, and so that hit the newspaper industry very hard is Craigslist.
And just social media now is taking it to another level because of all of the information that's available. And I think it was so easy for media outlets to monetize themselves in the early days of print when they were a standalone legitimate news source. And then you had TV that was kind of a standalone, or they could be legitimate. And now they have to compete with all of this information that's not vetted, that doesn't have any credibility. People like me who just can make a show and create content. And so it's harder to get people to advertise. I think that was probably really the death of the newspaper, was like that stuff only exists if people are willing to advertise on it. And now you just have such an influx and overload of information that people have to sift through that it's almost like, it doesn't really do the legitimate news sources any favors when there's such an influx of information out there. So,
well, thanks for having me.
yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate it. Before we get out of here, I ask each guest the same question at the end, or the same couple questions here. First off, what was the biggest surprise that hit you when you were writing the book, or you were getting into writing? Or the biggest surprise of AJ's life that stood out to you?
Well, their kind of willingness to take chances back then. He moved his whole family to come up here and in a frontier town, and of course, back in those days, you had no big 401k or worries about certain elements in your life. It was more of a risk-taking time period, and so that's something that stands out to me. Writing a book is kind of a lot of work because, and I also want to, because you've mentioned this, I should give credit to my editor, Kelly Hultgren, who put in a lot of work reading the manuscript and working with me to shift and improve it. And when I say that, Jake, is that there's a lot of chapters that were eliminated and a lot of chapters that I had to rewrite. And she had just a good sense of the arc and the flow of the book. And, my name is right here on the front cover. Her name is on maybe page 3 in small type. But I give her I give her credit as much as me for maybe the developing of the book. But I've heard people say, you need a good editor. But it's kind of a teamwork kind of thing.
Yeah.
I didn't really realize that maybe going into the whole writing of a book.
You're like, I'll just write a book. I'll just write a book. Yeah, interesting. All right. How about best business advice?
Best business advice. Ooh. Well, if you have a passion, I kind of label myself a little bit as an entrepreneur, and if you have a passion for something, research that, put some time into it. Just don't put yourself out there right away, but kind of follow your instincts. You only live once, and give it a go, because like I can't remember what poet said, but fail again, fail better, so to speak. But I think a lot of people are scared of failing. But when you say best business advice, you give it a go. If you fail, you might learn something and start something better, so.
I love it. Well, Ben, I really appreciate you taking this time to come share the story with the people. I'll get a link to the book, to your publisher's site to buy the book, or to Amazon. I don't know if you do audiobook. Is there an audio version of this? Can I listen to it?
There's a Kindle. I've yet to
Kindle.
I've yet to get it as an audiobook. But I'm just going to plug my website, www.pioneerofprint.com.
Pioneerofprint.com. I'll put that in the episode description then for the people. So, yes, again, thank you very much. Thank you to the sponsors, Stumbino's Coffee, Atlas Outdoor Services, Outstate Brewing, Victor Lundeen's, and Elks Point Bar and Grill, making the best buy one, get one smash burgers you can find on a Wednesday night. So, Ben, have a good one.
Thanks.
Yes, thank you.